was it only possible to control the image of Diana after her death, because she's seen from an American perspective to be a sort of something of a loose cannon? I don't think that the sort of battle for the meaning of Diana is really over. You know, there's been the inquest has been running for only finished I think 2 years ago. There's endless series of TV programs and stuff coming out about her. So I think that debate still carries on, and it carries on now in the relief of the rise to prominence, to public prominence of her two sons. So there's a way in which Diana is constantly referenced in the ceremonies this summer. Certainly from the perspective of the royal family, it's done and dusted. You know, and they have now, you know, they've moved on, and that saga seems to be, they appear to want to leave the memory of Diana in cold storage somewhere. Any other questions? Right, so now I'm going to talk about the riots in 81 in contrast. In July, riots broke out in London in a neighbourhood known as Brixton. And there had been earlier riots in Brixton before the royal wedding on the 10th and 12th of April. Indeed, there had been a series of protest marches and skirmishes in South London and in Bristol for the year before the big riots in July of 1981. Rather like this summer, the riots quickly spread beyond Brixton, throughout London, well, not throughout London, but in many communities in London, in Southall, in Battersea, in Dalston, in Streatham, and in Walthamstow. And then it spread to other cities. I'm not sure that I can do this very well. To Birmingham, to where is Birmingham there? To the Handsworth community in Birmingham, to Chapel Town in Leeds. This is a neighbourhood in Leeds. To Moss Side in Manchester there, and to Toxteth in Liverpool. And then to a bunch of other cities, which I'm not going to try and point out because there are too many of them. Much smaller disturbances in Leicester, in Ellesmere Port, which is near Liverpool, in Luton, in Leicester, in Sheffield. You don't need to get all of these. This just the point is for me to read out a long list. Portsmouth, Preston, Newcastle, Derby, Southampton, Nottingham, High Wycombe, Bedford, Edinburgh, Wolverhampton, Stockport, Blackburn, Huddersfield, Reading, Chester, and Aldershot. Quite a lot of places were rioting in July 2000. 2011 too, but July 1981. Now the point that I want to make here is that very often these riots happen in communities with large ethnic minority populations. Okay, and in Brixton it's very much about an Afro-Caribbean response to a series of policing policies, but it spreads out to these other communities in these cities that also have high Afro-Caribbean and Asian neighbourhoods. Not in all of them, not by any means. In the smaller ones that I read out, this was really not. This was basically a white riot in many of those smaller communities. How then do we explain these riots, and why did they occur? So the standard way at the time was to describe them as a race riot. Okay? And a couple of things I think were going on here. First of all, as you can see from this headline in The Sun, there was a way in which the violence was blamed on foreigners. Okay? Not foreigners, but on people who seem to represent a different that we're not British, we're not culturally British. So the headline here is to think that this is England. Okay? And the argument was that basically the Afro-Caribbean population in particular had no respect for the English traditions of the respect for law and order. No understanding of what people used to describe at the time as the British way of life. Enoch Powell, who had been a leading critic of immigration policy and had talked about the importance of repatriation from the late 1960s, said black youths are not alienated, they're alien. Okay? And this basically sums up this argument. That as more former colonial subjects arrived in Britain during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there was a dissolution of a British culture. And it had now reached this tipping point, and Powell warned in 1981 that they were very close to what he described as a civil war between different communities that couldn't find a point of common coherence. There's also, in the 70s, an unbelievable rise of extreme white racism, particularly, and this happens from the mid-1970s especially, but particularly attached to skinheads in the late 70s and early 80s. So a band with the immortal title The Foreskins had a concert in Southall on the 3rd of July that ended with violence against local Asian groups. And in Walthamstow, the three members of the Khan family were killed by an arson attack upon their homes. And these type of events really were not that uncommon. There was a series of sort of disparate racialized attacks against different communities. There was also, this is my second point, a history of racialized policing. Okay? With the election of Mrs. Thatcher, she does two things basically that are relevant here. One is passed the Nationalities Act in 1981, which removed, in 1948, the Nationalities Act had allowed all colonial subjects to have a de facto British citizenship. This basically removed that legislation, and you had to now not just be born in the UK, you had to have one parent who was a citizen, who was a British citizen, to be able to to stay in residence. And this law came in effect, even though it was passed in 1981, came into effect in January 1983. The other policy was to encourage the police to do more stop and searches under the so-called sus laws, which had been in place since the Vagrancy Act of 1824. Okay, so this is a very old law that allows police to stop and search suspects. Okay, but the police made increasing use of these powers from 1979, and indeed the riots in Brixton were in many ways catalysed by Operation Swamp, in which the Brixton police force stopped 943 people, arrested 118 in just 6 days. Okay, so a massive sort of police operation, ostensibly to crack down on criminality in the Brixton area. And this was part of the thing, that these communities, these ethnic communities, became criminalized, okay, and became associated with a breakdown of law and order. Another argument critically here is, of course, a more liberal argument that it was all about deprivation, liberal in the American sense, of deprivation and unemployment. Okay? In 1981, the Thatcher administration had introduced this big budget that brought in massive cuts to public services. There was escalating unemployment amongst all sections of the community. Unemployment rose by 1 million to 2.5 million in the 12 months before July 1981. So a serious rise of unemployment. And what this effectively did was introduce this new neoliberal political economy in Britain at that point. And I'm going to play you now Gavin's, if it works. This is the #1 hit during the wedding of Charles and Diana by the Specials, and it's called Ghost Town. I'm not going to play it all, but just so you get an idea.
This storm is coming and it goes down. All the clubs are being closed down. This place is coming like a ghost town. Bands won't play no more. Too much fighting on the dance floor. This place is coming like a ghost town. No job to be found in this country. Can't go on no more. The people getting hungry.
Okay, you get the idea. They don't make music videos like that anymore, but they did in my youth. It's an important moment. I mean, that this song is #1 during the royal wedding, #1 during the riots occurring in '81, and is a song produced by this band, the Specials, which came from Birmingham, mixed race band. Is ska still hip? It was like about a year ago or 18 months ago. Is it still? No? Is it? It's like, no? Clearly not amongst young people. But ska was also, of course, a huge thing was a huge part of skinhead culture in the late 70s and early 80s. So it was a very evocative song. Any questions on the '81 riots before we move into the fabulous Wills and Kate? Splendid. Okay. I really have to